So I handed my PhD thesis in March 2019. I think it was the day before or 2 days before the country went into lockdown. I handed it in person just in time. The thesis as a whole consists of 14 sections of prose, 7 groups of poems and 4 individual poems. My research throughout the PhD explored the ways in which lyric poetry, balanced between public and private discourse, might play a part in moving beyond merely naming the problem of sexism and instead become part of a movement for individual and social change. These events are part of that movement, and I hope the things I talk about tonight might spark off other conversations or take their place as part of an ongoing conversation about sexism and female desire. So as Nikolai said, there's going to be a series of polls throughout the event. So the thesis is set out with options that the reader can choose. So I thought I could replicate that with a Zoom event. And I just wanted to share, so I did a map of the thesis to show that kind of there's different ways that you can go through the writing. So I'm just going to share that map with you now. Not to do anything with it, just because it took me ages, and I want people to, otherwise nobody will ever see it. So there you go. So that's where I'm going to start now with desire lines, and then you can see all the different paths, through, and there's no linear way through it. So it will make sense if you wanted to read it from front to back, but it also makes sense kind of dotting all over the place. Okay, so I'm just going to read a shortened version of the introduction first of all. Sorry. And I'm just going to share the first part of the introduction, because it's a kind of cross between a poem and a lyric essay thing. Desire lines, variations on an introduction. 1. If choices are threaded through the body of a text, if the text is not a body, but a landscape. If the text is a landscape, there must be paths. If there is one path, there is always another. If text is a landscape with paths running through, then reading is a form of travel. If reading is a form of travel, readers must be travellers. Some of them will know where they are going. Some will be lost. If text is a landscape, if reading is a form of travel, if readers are travellers, then the text is a journey in itself. If the text is a journey and a landscape, if all landscapes have paths, if each path is a choice, a desire, if this text has its own desires, there are bodies within it, yours and mine. We may find ourselves meeting somewhere inside. 2. What you'll hear tonight is a creative, critical exploration of everyday sexism and female desire. This will take place as a reader-directed event where you, the audience, will be asked to make choices about what you would like to hear next. I'll ask you to make some of these choices based on your reaction to what you've just heard. At other times, I might ask you to make a choice based on your life experience or your identity. In this way, I hope to provoke, encourage, and challenge you to confront your own connectedness or distance from the text you have just heard. My inspiration in creating a reader-directed thesis and subsequently this reader-directed event stems from the Fighting Fantasy adventure series of role-playing game books, which were huge favourites of my childhood. These books made the reader a protagonist in the story, and gave them agency and control to make decisions about how they made their way through the text, giving an element of control over the narrative. I hope to replicate the choices that you would be given as readers in this event. I will read a section of prose or a small group of poems, and then you'll be asked to make a choice to allow me to move on to the next section. Each grouping of poems is prefaced by a title, or what I think of as a doorway, which indicates to the reader the lens through which to read these poems. For example, one group of poems is called An Electric Current, Poems of Willfulness. This title invites the reader to read willfulness into these poems or to read them for willfulness. However, some of these poems could just as easily move into a different grouping. These doorway titles are there to encourage the reader to both move with and push back against the way the poems have been categorized. By naming groups of poems, my aim is to create a way into the poems, but also to call into question whether the name or title is accurate, and to invite the reader to think about whether some of the poems would be better placed elsewhere. To confront the reader with the impossibility of saying what a poem is actually about, and the thought that a poem could be about different things at different times on different days. The titles of these groupings will function like coloured panes of glass that an audience can use to examine the poems, or different doorways into them, but I also hope that the reader is encouraged to put the poems into a different grouping or to make their own categories. I'd like to quote John Berger here, who says, "To look is an act of choice." I want to think about tonight about what we choose to look at in poetry. I think about looking and choice and paying attention. I want to think about noticing things, which can also be a way of dislocating perceptions, how these titles are a way of drawing the audience's notice to something, the desire in the poems, the willfulness in the poems, the violence in them. I think about how when we draw attention to something, its opposite also comes into view, waiting for us to notice it as well. 3. When I began to think about sexism, I noticed it more and more. When I began to think about sexism, I remembered more and more of it happening to me and around me. The noticing of sexism began to defamiliarize the world because it was not the world I thought it was. It became a defamiliarized world because I realized that sexism is a structure, a pattern, a series. It became a defamiliarized world because, as Sarah Ahmed writes, the past is magnified when it is no longer shrunk. We make things bigger just by refusing to make things smaller. I place sexism in a poem. It does not make it smaller. Ahmed points out that we need structure to give evidence of structure. I can create a microstructure of a poem to give evidence. I can use the scaffolding of line breaks and words lined up like bricks in a wall. But I can also see the macro structure of a poetry collection to give evidence, which is more like a body than a building, a body of work, a structure to give evidence of structure. So much of sexism takes place in the same space as conversations around female desire, whether this is in attempts to control it or pretend it doesn't exist, or to shame women for having it or admitting it. I did not realise at the start of this research that writing men, plural, was an uncovering of female desire and admitting to female desire, that this was risky business, that this uncovering meant a new and different performance of sexism, that it meant sexism could speak with a different voice. 4. It is important to recognise that the base of knowledge that this research is built on comes from my own experience of being white, working class and university educated. While this concrete experience can and will be used to draw wider conclusions about society and the place of women, it is important to note that it is impossible to represent all women's experiences with my own. Each woman's experience of sexism and female desire is shaped by and influenced by their race, class, sexuality, education, whether they identify as disabled, amongst other multiple variables. This research can only hope to shine one light onto this complex and multifaceted experience. Okay, and we're now going to go to the first poll.
Okay, so I'm launching this. Hopefully on your screens should have appeared the first question. So do you identify as a woman, man, non-binary? And whichever vote has the most, whichever option has the most vote will determine where we go next. There's a clear leader at the moment. I'll share the poll results with you once they're in. I think we've got a couple more votes to come in. Okay. There's 2 more to come, but they're not going to change the results. So here's the results coming in. So we've got 73% women, 20% man, and 7% non-binary.
I think that's the highest percentage of men that we've had at I've done 3 of these events now, and this is the highest percentage of male attendees. So I think
it might be the first time that's gone into double figures.
Yeah. So we're which kind of, yeah, I'm interested in how we talk. I think men have to be part of the conversation about sexism, but as soon as you put a label like feminism or sexism onto an event, it immediately kind of skews the audience that you're going to be talking to. And obviously I want to be talking to women as well, but it's finding ways of bringing men into that conversation as well. Okay, so we're starting with a poem. So all of the poems in the thesis, I forgot to say at the beginning, the poems are going to be a collection called All the Men I Never Married. So every poem has just got a number. It's just All the Men I Never Married, number 1, number 2, up to 48, I think. And now I've changed the order of the collection. So this is actually number 1 now, not number 40, but never mind about that. So All the Men I Never Married, number 40. Just make it a bit bigger. So there was the boy who I met in the park, who tasted of humbugs and wore a mustard yellow jumper, and the kickboxer with beautiful long brown hair that he tied with a band at the nape of his neck, and the one who had a constant ear infection, so I sat always on his left, and the guy who worked in an office and could only afford to fill up his car with £2 worth of petrol, and the trumpet player I loved from the moment I saw him, dancing to the Rolling Stones, and the guy who smoked weed and got more and more paranoid, whose fingers flickered and danced when he talked, and the one whose eyes were 2 pieces of winter sky, and a music producer, long-legged and full of opinions, and more trumpet players, one who was too short and not him, and one who was too thin and not him. Are you judging me yet? Are you surprised? Let me tell you of the ones I never kissed, or who never kissed me. The trombonist I went drinking with, how we lay twice a week in each other's beds like 2 unlit candles. We were not for each other, and in this we were wise. We were only moving through the world together for a time. There was a double bassist who stood behind me and angled the body of his bass into mine and shadowed my hands on its neck. And all I could feel was heat from his skin and the lightest breath. And even this might have been imagined. I want to say to them now, though all we are to each other is ghosts, once you were all that I thought of. When I whisper your names, it isn't a curse or a spell or a blessing. I'm not mourning your passing or calling you here. This is something harder, like walking alone in the dusk and the leaves. This is the naming of trees. This is a series of flames. This is watching you all disappear.
Okay. So coming on to our second poll. Here it comes. You've just got 2 choices here. To hear, yes, I am judging you, vote in the first option, or to hear how poems of desire can be a mode of attention, vote for the second one. pretty neck and neck, this one. It's 3 votes to come. They could swing it either way.
Maybe they've fallen asleep already.
Should we pause it there? I'm not very good at maths, but I don't think the last 2 are going to change it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jane's just said doesn't understand. So if that's about the polling, Jane, with each one that after each section that a poll will flash up on the screen, and then it's literally just clicking on one of the options that's available for that poll, and it counts the vote of you for that particular option. So in true democratic style, the majority rules in this, and the majority will dictate which pathway we follow through the material. Feel free to message if that's still not clear. So as you can see with this one, it was pretty close, but we're going to move on to hear about how poems of desire can be a mode of attention.
Okay. So there's normally about 7 or 8 poems in each group, but I'm probably just going to read a few. I won't read them all, basically, because Poems of Desire, a Mode of Attention. All the Men I Never Married, number 14. I imagine you at home on the other side of the world, in a town I don't know the name of, driving your wife mad, leaving your laptop in the fridge when you go to get a beer. It's hot. You're wearing shorts and a dark t-shirt. Your white feet look like 2 fish washed up on a beach and gasping their last breath. I know this, although I've not seen your feet in this life. The last time I saw you, you were fully clothed, black jacket, jeans, but now without them, I can see you stand with a stoop, your shoulders hunched, your body apologetic. You are singing something I can't make out. Your high, thin voice threads through the window and across time zones and oceans to me here. When I think of your voice, my soul drifts downwards inside my body, like a leaf falling side to side through the air. Remember that night we were leaning into each other, like 2 doors loosening from their hinges. Remember the darkness and how we almost held hands. It wasn't even that I wanted to, but I didn't not want to. It was complicated. Yeah. All the Men I Never Married, number 2. I knew he was dangerous, knew he was not mine, knew he belonged to another who he'd left behind, easy as slipping off a coat. Knew that was a bad sign, but didn't know enough to turn aside, to turn my back, to not pick up the phone when his name appeared. Oh, I knew nothing back then. I thought sex, what a word to cough on. Sorry. Oh, I knew nothing back then. I thought sex was a promise that would keep being fulfilled. I thought love was a knife pressed to the throat. Not just his, not just mine. I thought there was a blade in each of our hands. I am telling this now so he appears, as real as that first night when we didn't sleep, the slight red stubble of his beard, the freckles covering his arms, his gaze, his attention, all mine. Oh, back then I never wanted it to end. The touching, the looking. I knew nothing of how a person is already fractured or broken by the time we meet them. It was just like Rilke said, his gaze was a lamp turned low. Although at that point I had not read Rilke, knew nothing about what it means to be seen, what it means to change or be changed, to appear, to burst like a star.
So the next poll is coming up now. There's going to be 3 options here. If you do not want to look away, turn to Not Looking Away, a Poetics of Attention. If you're interested in what can happen to the female poet when performing, vote for The Body is the Blind Spot of Speech. Or if you'd like to hear All the Men I Never Married, number 40, vote here. Votes are coming in thick and fast. We've got a clear winner here. Is your voice all right, Kim? Okay, the votes are in, and here are the results. So as you see, we've got a clear winner of what can happen to the female poet when performing. So we're moving on to The Body is the Blind Spot of Speech.
Thanks. The body is the blind spot of speech. Judith Butler wrote that in speaking, the act that the body is performing is never fully understood. The body is the blind spot of speech. Who is she talking about? Is it the speaker lacking understanding or the audience? Maybe it is both. When I read the word blind spot, I think of my driving instructor telling me to check my blind spot before pulling out into the road. The blind spot as danger, as something where trauma can occur if not checked, if not noticed. I think of the twisting of the body as I look over my shoulder. The blind spot is the place where things or people are missed. In the summer of 2018, I am a guest poet at a festival in a hot country. Another poet tells me she enjoyed my reading and then says, "I'm sure you know exactly what you're doing, reading poems about men with your legs out." I know what I said in that reading and could list the poems I read, but I do not know what I am doing or what my body was saying. My body was saying something, all on its own. The body is the blind spot of speech, and I do not know what it whispers. What do I say with my body when I am performing? When I read poems about sexism, what does my body say about sexism? When I read poems about female desire, what does my body say about female desire? Of course, the desire I'm exploring is a desire from the past, a desire that has already both lived and died. The reader knows this because of the title of these poems, All the Men I Never Married, and the use of numbers to differentiate between them, the relentless marching on of numbers, and the unspoken promise that there will always be one more number. In A Lover's Discourse, Barthes writes that the love which is over and done with in each poem passes into another world, like a ship into space. The love that is over and done with in each poem passes into the white space between the poems, and moving from one poem to the other, moving from one relationship to the other, is, as Barthes says, like acceding to another logic. He argues that historically the discourse of absence is carried on by the woman. Woman is sedentary, man hunts, journeys. Woman is faithful, she waits. Man is fickle, he sails away, he cruises. It is easy to think of examples from literature. Penelope waiting for Odysseus to return. Sleeping Beauty not only waiting for the prince to find her, but waiting in sleep, completely cut off from the world. However, in these poems, the opposite is happening. The female gaze is always moving, always searching. It finds what it is looking for, what it must gaze at. It gives this its full attention, and then stops looking and moves on to the next man, the next relationship, the next betweeners, as Irigaray calls it. I'm speaking about sexism, and maybe my body tells of desire. I'm speaking about desire, and maybe my body calls sexism into the room. If absence can become an active practice, as Barth says, by speaking about desire which has passed, which is in the past, by using language to tell about desire, I am manipulating absence. By addressing the men in these poems through the use of the pronoun you, they are both absent and present. They are here because they are being addressed, but they are also absent in that they are nowhere to be found, except in language. When Barthes writes, "What I hide by my language, my body utters," he is talking about hiding his passion, his desire. I am doing one thing with my language and one thing with my body. The woman who said, "I'm sure you know exactly what you're doing," was certain of this. She smiled when she said it. The body is the blind spot of speech, and its acts are never fully understood. Parts of the body, like bare legs, become sexual signifiers, and when your body is a sexual signifier, the assumption is always that this is deliberate, that you know what you're doing. The body is performed not by the speaker, but by observers who project meaning onto the surface of the body. When Judith Butler writes that to be injured by speech is to suffer a loss of context, I know she's talking about hate speech, and I'm just talking about a woman making a remark about my legs. But I remember my cheeks burning, because in that moment I felt like I was a body, not a person, certainly not a poet. Can any speech act that means the listener suffers a loss of context be deemed an injurious address, as Butler calls it? When a reviewer mentions an author's photo and shade of lipstick in a discussion of their work, the loss of context is the delaying or sidelining of a discussion of the poet's work rather than their appearance. The body is the blind spot of speech, and I know nothing and everything about what it says. When Butler writes that the body is sustained and threatened through modes of address, it is my body and yours she is talking of. The bodies of audiences and readers can be both sustained and threatened by poetry that addresses them directly, that asks them a question, or poetry that asks them to imagine, to show empathy with the speaker. Audiences can be both sustained and threatened by poetry that asks them to empathize, to feel, that ignores them entirely and talks to someone else. When Butler writes that by addressing another, we expose the body of the other as vulnerable to address, then the possibility of understanding something about power, who has it and who does not, is revealed. In All the Men I Never Married, number 9, the taxi driver in the poem tells the speaker to relax, just relax, even though the speaker has not communicated verbally that she's frightened. The body communicates in place of language. In this poem, the arm of the speaker flings open the door before she gives it permission. The body not as the unconscious happening, but the conscious. The speaker in this poem knows that this is a dangerous situation, yet tries to pretend it is normal. The rules of polite society bind her much more tightly than the man she's in a car with, but the body will not be bound by these rules or expectations. The unruly arm with a mind of its own reminds me of The Willful Girl, a fairy tale explored at length in Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, but originally a Grimm's fairy tale. The willful girl who will not do as she is told. Eventually, God allows her to become ill because she is willful and she dies. Even in death, her arm rises from the grave until her mother takes a rod and beats the arm until it is still. In All the Men I Never Married, number 9, a poem with the taxi driver in, willfulness is figured as silent resistance, as running away, as moving away, as removing the self from the situation. When this willfulness, this resistance shows itself, the speaker is told to relax. Ahmed tells us that when we are not willing to participate in sexist culture, we are willful. The body of the speaker is not willing to sit in the car with the taxi driver a moment longer than necessary, even while the speaker is willing to placate and pacify by giving the driver a tip. The body as willful, the arm as willful, though the speaker was not, though the speaker was silent and did not speak up. The arm as the active agent that flings open the door. The leg, not a bare leg this time, but the leg in this poem has a will of its own, and it finds the pavement before I can think. In this poem, the ground may not be in the place it is expected. In this poem, it is possible to be both willful and willing, to resist and to comply. Ahmed points out that the story of the willful girl is addressed to a willing girl who does not appear in the text. The willing girl is the reader of this story, this warning. I do not want to address my poetry to a willing girl or a willing woman. I do not want it to be a warning about what could happen to you as a woman. It cannot be a warning because situations like this are already happening and have happened to women. Can a poem be a call to be willful, to allow the body to be willful, to know what it knows and to act upon it? Maybe there is no such thing as a willful woman girl or a willing woman girl. In real life, we are all composites of both of these figures, and we move between the two of them consciously and unconsciously. I want my poems to address the willful, willing woman and call her to attention. I want the call to willfulness, willingness to be a call both to the body and to language. I also want to address those men who are part of this story. As Ahmed points out, so often people do not recognize their actions as violent. By placing the space of a poem around the retelling of this incident, by using the female gaze to generate empathy, I hope that this poem addresses men too and allows them to recognize and rethink their own roles and actions in a society where sexism is normal behavior. The story of the willful girl and Ahmed's discussion around willfulness helped me to come to terms with my own complicity in the incidents explored in the poem. Through her discussion of willfulness, that willfulness can be situated in the body as well as in language, I began to understand that part of the process of becoming a feminist is acquiring a will of one's own, as Ahmed writes, and that in this acquisition, she says, willfulness is an electric current. It can pass through each of us, switching us on.
Okay, on to the next poll. So again, just as with the last one, there's 3 options in this one. So the first one, if your body's ever been willful, please vote here for an electric current, poems of willfulness. If you'd like to consider what is between us, please vote for Between Us, a Poetics of Willfulness. If you'd like to hear about judgment, vote here for Yes, I Am Judging You. It's quite close at the moment about where we're going to go next. Just a couple more votes to come in. Okay, I think we've got a winner. So as you can see, we're going to go towards an electric current, poems of willfulness.
Okay. I think the taxi driver poem that I talked about, I'm hoping it's in this section, but I can't remember. All the Men I Never Married, number 20. When he tells me I'm not allowed to play with cars because I'm a girl, I bring his arm up to my mouth and bite. I'm sent to the Wendy house to pretend to be good. Blank-faced dolls stare up at me. Pretend oven filled with plastic fish fingers. Pretend windows with flowery curtains sewn by someone else's mother. Pretend Hoover, pretend washing machine, pretend teapots and tea set. I watch through a gap in the wall as my teacher sits in her chair, crossing her legs in the way she told us only yesterday we should copy. Be ladylike, she said. Stop showing your knickers. I'm burning in here as she calls the class to order, waits for them to cross their legs and settle. I long to sit at her feet, listen to all the old stories of sleeping and women who wait to be rescued. The book is a bird, its wings held tight in her hands. She bends the cover back so the spine cracks, balances it on one palm, turns to me and tells me, turn around, at once, face the wall. So this is All the Men I Never Married, number 21. And the you in this poem is my sister, who is here, which I wouldn't normally say, but she'll kill me if I don't acknowledge her. She likes having poems written about her. All the Men I Never Married, number 21. That a man approached you in a nightclub, that you were polite at first, then turned your back, that he insisted on giving you his number, that you put it in your pocket, that you danced with your friend all night, that he stood and watched you, that you were drinking tequila, that you licked salt from the back of your hand, that he was waiting outside, that when he grabbed your arm and spun you round, you snapped, that you've always had a temper, that you were not afraid, that you swung your fist and clipped his jaw, that he kicked you between the legs, that he shouted, I will end you, that you fell to the pavement, that he tried to kick you again, that he shouted, I will end you, I will end you, I will end you, that a bouncer came and held him back, that the police were called, that he vanished into the night, that you were taken to the station, that he turned up with his lawyer, that you still hadn't sobered up, that he was smirking, that it was Freshers' Week, that you were in pain, that it was hard to explain about his number in your pocket, that you became afraid, that you were advised not to press charges, that you hit him first, that this all happened many years ago, that you laugh about it now, that you say, well, I shouldn't have hit him, that I both agree and disagree with this statement, that being our bodies in public is a dangerous thing, that being in public is a dangerous thing, that our bodies are dangerous things. So talking about me grouping the poems into groups, I thought the taxi driver was in here and he's not, so I've put him somewhere else. Never mind, he'll probably appear later. All the Men I Never Married, number 25. If I'm ever bored of monogamy, I'll come and find you. We'll go to bed and do things we would not do with any other. I will not name them here. I don't blame you for asking, I blame you for not asking sooner. I used to think you were a user. I thought I knew what a user was. I thought it was just lust, but you were the best at some things, the best that I've known. How we pretended none of it mattered. It's splendid to look back on it now. It was splendid to know you. If I'm ever bored of monogamy, I know who to turn to. I'll just do one more of these. All the Men I Never Married, number 31. One of my exes shared my poem on Facebook and wrote, I'm glad you didn't write one about me. And I replied, how do you know I didn't write one about you? And he wrote back, because only the women in my family know the real me. So I replied, I think you've misunderstood what a poem is for. Then he wrote, okay, I'll let you win this one, just like you won my heart, poem, which pissed me off because of his use of brackets. Also, there was no winning of hearts. Once I saw him sniffing cocaine from a toilet seat in the ladies' loo, and when he turned and looked back at me, his eyes were bright, like crushed flowers left inside a book. I never saw him cry or get angry or shout. I made him laugh but couldn't tell you what it felt like. I never borrowed one of his shirts and forgot to give it back, although there were nights I wore his boxer shorts to bed. I saw him lots with no clothes on, but loved best seeing him in just his jeans, the way they hung from his hips, the bones jutting out like two beautiful half-formed wings. His skin was always full of sun. He was never white, not even in winter when I turned pale. On our first date, we went to an art gallery and I hated him for it because I'd never been to one and didn't know what to do. Once we walked from his house to town and he kept asking me over and over why the cranes all point the same way. And I said I didn't know. And he said, well, think about it logically. And I kept saying, I don't know. I knew if I started one thought in my head about those cranes or uttered one word about them, I'd never look him in the eye again, and there'd be some sort of permanent damage to my heart. Now I have to tell him I wrote a poem about him, but at least I can say, you were right. I didn't know you. I didn't know you at all.
Okay, thanks, Kim. So, moving on to the next poll. Here we go. So again, there's going to be 3 options about to appear. If you'd like to see what is between us, vote for Between Us, a Poetics of Perception. If you'd like to hear Doing Gender, vote for the second one. And if you've ever watched the Goo Goo Dolls singing Iris in the Rain, or will once this event has ended and it's raining outside my window right now, vote here for To Give an Account of the Self.
Have you launched the poll, Nikolai?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you have. I've got it. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I can see it now. It's fine. Sorry.
That was pretty close for a while, but it looks like we've got a runaway leader. Okay, so I think almost all the votes are in. I'm not going to change what we've got now, so let me share what we've got. As you can see, we've got 53% who'd like to hear Doing Gender. So that's where we're moving next.
I haven't read this one out before. This bit.
That's the great thing, isn't it? You never really know where it's going to go.
And also, it's always scary reading the prose out the first time because some of it I've cut back for the event. You know, I've deleted some bits that I didn't think would work. But anyway, so Doing Gender. I'm thinking about the kind of trouble these poems will get me into, have got me into. I'm thinking about Judith Butler and the binary of man and woman I have set up in these poems, how the numbering of each poem allows each man to march past in their singularity and plurality, men plural, and I constituted in relationality to all of them. All the men I did not marry, apart from the one I did, significant in his absence, who is summoned into being at the margin of each of these poems, as all the men I did not marry come into view. In Gender Trouble, Butler contested binary terms like man and woman, arguing that gender is not something we are, but something we continually do, arguing that gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance, of a natural sort of being. Gender is a set of repeated acts, but being a woman and repeating stories about men is not something women are expected to do. If Butler is correct and it is the performing of gender that creates the subject, then a woman admitting to desire in a world where this is not recognized as typically feminine subverts expectations of how women should behave, both towards men and in themselves. This challenging of the heterosexual framework is a radical act and has often proven to be unsettling to readers and audiences at performances. But I also consciously exploit this unsettlement on a regular basis. I announced that my next collection will be called All the Men I Never Married. Some of the audience will smile. I say I am still writing it and I am currently at number 30 and people laugh. It is an easy way of getting a laugh at the start of the reading, but increasingly I feel more and more dishonest. I am provoking a laugh at the audacity of a woman talking about 30 men and desire, but I'm bored of it being audacious. At a reading, a man who looks as if he is in his mid to late 60s comes up to me and nudges me as if I have known him for years. "You don't look old enough to have known all those men," he says, and winks. When he says the word known, he emphasizes it, his voice dropping lower. I smile and say something like, "Well, artistic license," and he nods and says, of course, of course." I feel suddenly exhausted. I think about knowing and how we know anything. Did I know any of them? Is this what the whole thing is about, trying to get to know them again? In the poem I've just read about the X and Facebook, a man states that the speaker could not have written a poem about him because only the women in my family know the real me. The speaker points out that this is a misunderstanding of what a poem is for. The rest of the poem is a series of intimate details about this man. His eyes are bright like crushed flowers left inside a book. The poem talks about the bones of his hips jutting out like two beautiful half-formed wings. However, despite this succession of recollections, the speaker concludes that "you were right, I didn't know you at all." The implication that now the speaker suddenly sees more clearly and knows the man in a better or at least different way to the way she knew him in the past is a suggestion, or maybe even a ghost of a suggestion. Catherine Angel writes that writing is how I experience my experience. And this sense of gaining a deeper understanding of the past and the present for the writer goes its way through all of these poems. Butler writes that we regularly punish those who fail to do their gender right. Women have always been punished for their sexual histories. The man who nudged me, who told me I was not old enough to have known all of those men, was talking about sex without using the word. I was 11 years old when I was first called frigid because I did not want to kiss a boy in my class, and 12 when I was called a slut. But that man is not a 12-year-old boy, and I am not that 12-year-old girl anymore. Part of the job of being woman or even girl has been to negotiate these categories, to, as Butler says, give an account of myself, to have a life that slides between and past these terms until now, with these poems, in the performing of these poems. At the same reading, I leave the stage and a younger man in his 30s approaches me and compliments me first on my shoes and then my jumper. He says the shape of my jumper looks like I'm wearing a holster, that I look like I don't take any mess in. He does not mention anything about the reading, even though I've just stepped off the stage. And though the female gaze is, as Jill Soloway writes, a truth gaze and a see me gaze, I can't force him to see me, when what he wants to see is woman, not as poet, but as gendered body. I smile and thank him for the compliments and wonder about the type of messing I take and am taking. When Butler says the very terms by which we give an account, by which we make ourselves intelligible to ourselves and to others, are not of our making, they are social in character and they establish social norms, I know what she means. Somewhere between my language and the receiving of it, something happens that I am not in control of. My words must be heard through social norms, as if social norms are the distorted panes of glass we must peer through before we see, hear anything at all. The social norms that came into play in that moment at the reading were ones that meant that that man found it more comfortable and less scary to relate to me as a body rather than as a poet, to take notice of my body rather than the words that I gave to the air between us. When I give a reading about sexism or female desire on a stage in front of an audience, I am, as Butler says, doing something with this telling, acting on you in some way. And this telling is also doing something on me, acting on me, in ways I may well not understand as I go. Sometimes this telling is uncomfortable or difficult for some of the audience, and someone, usually a man but not always, approaches me because the telling has done something to them and they might not like it. I am engaged in a process of recognition between myself and the audience, but what they recognize might not be the thing I want them to recognize. There is always a constitutive loss in the process of recognition, since the I is transformed through the act of recognition. Sometimes I will be transformed from a poet into a female body. And as Butler writes, to be a body is in some sense to be deprived of having a full recollection of one's life. The life that I am telling is not the life they hear. Sexism and acts of sexism can be seen as part of a gender performance we place on the body of others as well as our own, which enable performances of masculinity and sexuality. There are ways in which, as Butler says, a body shows or produces its cultural signification. If a man does not join in with sexism, he might be considered less of a man. If women are not flattered by compliments, they can be accused of being unfriendly, aggressive, ungrateful. Sexism is part of the process of doing gender. And as Butler points out, if human existence is always gendered existence, then to stray outside of established gender is in some sense to put one's very existence into question. When I stray outside of established gender by standing on stage and reading poems about sexism and female desire, some people feel the need to place me back in my established gender role to make sure I understand that they see me as a body. Though it is now becoming more acceptable to speak publicly about sexism, serious assault and rape, speaking out can still lead to punishment, to ridicule, to disbelief. Sexism is a gendered activity. Men are the main, not the only, performers of it, and sexism helps to keep the binary categories of man and woman alive and breathing. Sarah Saller argues that for Michael Foucault, merely speaking about sex was a way of simultaneously producing and controlling it. Is this also true of sexism? When I speak about sexism in a performance, sexism is often produced in the room, like an echo or a call and response to the sexism I have spoken about. When this happens, can I control or change it? And if I can, how? Can I change it by writing about it, relating it here in this thesis, in this reading, witnessing it, retelling it? There was a book I found in my research called 52 Men by the surname of the author is Leonard. I'll have to look up her first name later. In this book, 52 Men, she carries out a genre-bending act of literary innovation. It's a cross between the prose poem, memoir, and autobiographical fiction, a series of 52 portraits of men she's been in relationships with. She uses the first name of each man, revealing intimate details about herself, the men, and her relationship with them. Sometimes these portraits drawn in language are accompanied by a photo of the actual man concerned. The photos and the names make each of the 52 completely specific, or at least give the appearance of specificity. Whilst being utterly compelling, and I would recommend the book, in some ways they let the reader off the hook. There is no chance of them seeing themselves or their behaviour in the text because they are so intimate. They are not 52 ways of being a man, but rather 52 reports of how these men were men with this woman. If each of the poems in my thesis looks at a man and in doing so says, this is a man, and then changes its mind and says, no, this is a man, no, this is a man, then the category of man and what it means to be a man becomes shifty and unstable. These poems are not, in fact, looking at men. When we look at anything, we are always, as John Berger writes, looking at the relation between things and ourselves. These poems are looking at a man in relation to a woman, which is another thing entirely, a different thing altogether to looking at a particular man standing alone.
Okay. So up comes the next poll should be coming your way again. Again, there's 3 choices in this one. So the first one is, if you've ever been objectified, vote to hear the body is the blind spot of speech. If you've ever objectified someone, vote here to hear the body is the blind spot of speech. And if you would like to hear All the Men I Never Married, number 38, vote for the third option.
I think I've read that body is the blind spot of speech, haven't I?
Yeah, thought you were bringing us back to it.
Well, it's a prosy bit, so I probably won't read all the prose again unless people...
Although it's
the problem might be solved anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Those last 7 votes could have a significant impact.
I did put loops in the thesis so that you could get stuck on a loop and never escape, because that sometimes happens in the fighting fantasy game books. You get stuck in a dungeon and you can't get out. You just keep going round and round in circles. But I won't do that here because it'll probably get really annoying.
I wanted to know if any of your examiners got stuck in a loop and just found themselves rereading the same bit over and over. Okay, I think that's pretty much all the votes that are coming in here. So it's very close, as you can see, but we have a marginal winner of Hearing All the Men I Never Married, number 38. So right. You've taken us out of the loophole.
Out of the loophole. Hold on, I'll just find it. Sorry. Got it. I don't think I've read this one either, at these events anyway. So All the Men I Never Married, number 38. I let a man into my room because I couldn't bear the thought of him with someone else. Even though he wasn't, never had been, never would be mine. I showed a man into my room as if I was selling him the space. I opened the door and let a shadow follow me inside. I didn't turn on the light. I turned on every light. I allowed a man into my room and he was kind. I let a man push past me through the door and told myself I didn't really mind. I let a man follow me to my room and didn't close the door in time. I let a man into my room which turned into a lift, and we were together, then apart, then together, then apart, depending on whether the door was open wide. I let a man into my body and let him sleep inside my room. I let him in, I let him in. I said that he could do those things, but only in my mind. I let a man into my room and took a vow of silence, took a vow of there's no turning back, because a mind is not for changing. The men inside my room do not like leaving. They think they know my name, but one of us is lying. I step across the threshold. I follow them inside. Once they're in, they're in. I open, then I close my eyes. And I don't think there's a poll for the, let me just check. I think I just go on here to the next section because it relates directly to this poem. Yeah, I'll just share the screen to prove that I'm not swindling you all. I'm just doing what I want. So there's the end of the poem, and then it's going straight on to the Annihilation of Men, which some of you might be worried about. If you're a man, you might be about to get annihilated. So I haven't read this section either, so I don't know if this works. I might just share this actually because it saves me doing the. So this is about a Twitter exchange that I had about that poem, and I posted the timeline as part of my PhD thesis, but with the names blacked out of the person in question. So 13th of March, that poem, All the Men I Never Married, number 38, was published in the New Statesman under the title I Let a Man. 20th of March, someone tweets me and tags me in it. What a horrible, unpleasant poem, I Let a Man. Take a step further and you can objectify all men, and we know where that trail leads. I rather childishly just retweeted it and quoted it and said, oh dear, this poem has upset another man, #poetry shame. That was 10:47 a.m. 10:51 a.m. I get a tweet back. Unfortunately, it is part of a current trend to denigrate men and is the respectable face of potentially extremist ideology. Objectifying men is one small step from racism and other forms of extremism. It's nasty stuff. 10:59 a.m. Another tweet. Objectifying men is no response to previous wrongs. The tone of the poem is horrible. It presents all men as being a certain way. As I say, it's a step away from extremist ideology. So then there was a whole kind of Twitter storm in between, and people kind of telling this person that they were being an idiot, to sum it up. And then 25th of March, I got an apology. My apologies to Kinmore Poet about last week. The poem was more personal than political. I was out of line. Sorry. So I left it a day just to let them sweat, and then said, thank you for the apology. I appreciate that. Without getting into an argument, I would say the personal is political and social, of course, but then I would say that best wishes. And I kind of thought no more about it and thought it would all blow over. There was then a letter published in the New Statesman from this same person. I'm writing after reading Kinmore's poem, I Let a Man. Given the magazine's substantial male readership, I'm surprised that you published this poem. Moore's abilities as a poet are not in question. Why, thanks. However, I am disturbed by the ideological stance the poem takes. It is part of a growing liberal backlash against men, seeking to denigrate and reduce them at every turn. Take Moore's stance to its extreme conclusion, which is being echoed in many ways and through many platforms, and it will result in the annihilation of men, as outlined in V. Solanas's The Scum Manifesto. Other readers and poets were more supportive. I've blacked these names out as well, but someone tweeted, I'm late to reading both the poem and this thread, and I'm confused by an angry response to a nuanced piece of writing, which apart from anything else does not offer a single truth, but makes something unsettling and beautiful out of the tapestry of experience, like good art can. Someone else replies, I thought it was an outstanding, unsettling poem. Interestingly enough, the title refers to a man and not all men. I've included those exchanges so that I wasn't basically presenting this incident as a complete kind of victimhood of this person complaining about the poem and poor Kim. I wanted to show, not to show off and say, oh, these people said the poem was amazing, but to show that I did have a lot of, that people were being supportive, and yeah, it wasn't like I felt bullied or anything. Throughout all of these exchanges, I begin to wonder about the word objectification, which he kept repeating. It's not the first time a man has accused me of objectifying men in a poem, although it is the first time this poem has had that accusation levelled at it. I wonder if this man knows what objectifying means. I wonder if I know what objectifying means. Martha C. Nussbaum writes that at the heart of objectification is the action of treating a human being as an object, and identifies 7 different ways of doing this. These include instrumentality. The objectifier treats the object as a tool of his or her purposes. Denial of autonomy. The objectifier treats the object as lacking in autonomy and self-determination. Inertness. The objectifier treats the object as lacking in agency and perhaps also in activity. Fungibility, where you treat the object as interchangeable with other objects of the same type or with objects of other types. Violability, where you treat an object as lacking in boundary integrity, as something that it is permissible to break up, smash, or break into. Ownership, where the objectifier treats the object as something that is owned by another, can be bought or sold. And then denial of subjectivity, when the objectifier treats the object as something whose experience and feelings, if any, need not be taken into account. Nussbaum argues that these 7 different ways of objectifying someone can take place in conjunction or in different combinations or one at a time, and it is possible to objectify without knowing. In the thesis, at this point, I undertake a line-by-line analysis to examine in that poem if there was any objectification present in the text. I'm not going to read that analysis here because I think it's too in-depth to do in a live performance and without the poem in front of you. Needless to say, I argue that there isn't any objectification, or if there is, it is a self-objectification, in that the speaker is recounting behaviour and things that happened that meant they were lacking in boundary integrity. letting different men into a room, and as something whose experiences and feelings are not taken into account. This lack of boundary integrity permeates the poem, and the lack of boundaries around entering or leaving a room, which the reader would presume to be a bedroom, perhaps the most private and intimate space in a place of residence. The other reason I'm not going to read that analysis is because I don't want to replicate the extra labour that women have to do when writing. Not only do we need to create, to write, but then we are often called upon to defend our words, to re-explain them because of bad faith arguments. Instead, I would like to talk about the role that poetry can play in examining the complexities of power, control, complicity, consent, victim blaming, and responsibility. These are not questions that can be solved by poetry, but poetry can pose questions about them and the role they play in our own lives. Poetry can be a way of opening up these words for investigation, of establishing that there are whole worlds within these words that need to be investigated. Poetry can be a way of examining irregularries between us, between self and other, between writer and reader. The speaker in the poem I've just read, I Let a Man, moves against a landscape of violence and yet carries on anyway. In some ways, it is the speaker who is the shadow slipping in and out of the room, and we never catch sight of her. Her ambivalence, her two-mindedness, her undecidedness is impossible to control, and maybe is this which is also threatening to some male readers when they read this poem. Instead of defending myself against the accusation of objectification, I would like to talk about the difficulty and complexity of desire. Catherine Angel argues that sex is social, emergent, and responsive. It is a dynamic, a conversation. Our desires emerge in interaction. We don't always know what we want. Sometimes we discover things we didn't know we wanted. Sometimes we discover what we want or don't, only in the doing. This complexity around desire, an attempt to discuss it even in a poem, can often prompt men to try and shut down the conversation. Writing poems about the men I never married is not an attempt to talk about women's desire in a vain hope that acknowledging female desire will eventually mean women will stop being shamed for having it. Women will probably always continue to be shamed for not knowing what they want, which has also been described as leading someone on. Worse than this, it is dangerous as a woman to admit to having desire. As Angel points out, a cursory glance through reports of rape cases where the way a woman is dressed or the fact that she met her attacker on a dating website proves this. If a discussion of female desire can invite a performance of sexism into the room and invite men to recenter themselves in the conversation, then this can be used to advantage if this process is then held up to the light and questioned. It is interesting to me now that I felt the need to prove that the poem did not objectify men, that I felt the need to justify myself, that I don't feel that need now. Experiential poetry can describe what it is like to live as a woman in what Catherine Angel calls a landscape of violence. At the same time, merely writing a poem about women's experience can recreate that same landscape of violence, where women have to waste time and energy explaining and defending their creative choices to write about lived experience. However, a positive aspect of this exchange is that it opens other people's eyes to the reality that they are also living in this landscape of violence. Men and women live in this landscape together, and we are all implicated, impacted, and changed by it in different ways. Lyric poetry can hold a space open for a discussion of the complexity of desire, even if some people choose not to engage. If finding out what we want in terms of desire, only in the doing, can be talked about in a lyric poem, the next step is to discover how to talk about desire in this way in real life. How to acknowledge that it is both a conversation and a dynamic.
Okay, bring us on to the next poll, the Annihilation of Men. Again, there's going to be 3 options appearing for you. So the first one, if you have been a long time without thinking, vote for All the Men I Never Married, number 11. If you'd like to hear about judgment, vote for Yes, I Am Judging You. And if you'd like to think about desire, vote for Poems of Desire, A Mode of Attention. Those votes are coming in here. There's a very clear one in the lead.
Just while I'm waiting, Katie Hale's in the Zoom meeting, and that tweet that I sent back to the man who said I was calling for the annihilation of men in the poem, I'm blaming Katie Hale because I typed it out. We were in a taxi on the way to a festival in Cork, and I said, shall I send it, Katie? And she was like, yeah, go on, just do it. So it's her fault. But it did give me like another 3,000 words for my PhD thesis.
I want to know if he comes to any of these events, Kim.
No, well, he's not here so far.
Okay, we've pretty much got all the votes in here. So as you can see, there's a fairly clear winner on this one and the second one about hearing, yes, I am judging you. Share that so you can see I'm not making it up. Okay.
And I haven't read this one either. This section either. Oops, hold on. Which has been weird in the other event, because for me this is it's kind of where the critical part of my thesis started, and it's a really important bit of it to me. So yes, I am judging you, and it refers back to that poem I first started with, where I listing all the men. Yes, I am judging you. It's November and mist has swallowed the grounds of the hotel. From my place at the window, it looks as if the drive leads away to nothing. It's the type of mist that leaves drops of water clinging to your hair and clothes, the type of grey November day that blurs the boundary between sea and sky. I am here as an after-dinner speaker for the Grange-over-Sands Luncheon Club, the glamour of a poet's life. Their booked speaker cancelled with only a day's notice, so instead of a talk about knife crime in Manchester, the unsuspecting Luncheon Club members will instead receive a poetry reading. I begin with the poem All the Men I Never Married, number 40, and when I reach the line, are you surprised? Are you judging me yet? An elderly woman shouts out, yes. People around me laugh. I laugh, and my laughter takes me by surprise because it is a performance of laughter. There's something funny and not funny about this moment. This poem relates the sexual history of a speaker and puts it on public display. It runs the risk of oversimplifying the men included within it through the summing up of their characters with one or two sentences. The white space of the poem, which translates to pauses in a performance, leave room for judgment, for interruption. The poem is deliberately walking a tightrope between objectification and the true seeing of the other. John Berger's insistence that the look is an act of choice runs through my mind every time I perform this poem. I'm choosing in this poem to look at men, to be the wielder of the gaze, to make men the gazed upon, which feels risky, which feels dangerous, to look and not to look away. To look at one man, then another, to watch them all disappear, which they do in that in the poem they're not spoken of again, but also they do not, because once spoken of they are conjured into existence. Vicki Bertram argues that women poets in any performance of their work have to confront the implications of being a female on public display, with the connotations of sexual objectification in a context that traditionally disregards the body. The context that Bertram refers to is the poetry reading, that hallowed space where poets perform or declaim or read and audience members sit and listen. The question in All the Men I Never Married, number 40, is a radical act, destabilising the authority of the poet by its use of direct address and its invitation for dialogue and response. The question also destabilises the audience because it moves away from the conventional idea of a traditional poetry reading, where the audience is expected to sit and receive, as Bertram puts it, wisdom and perception distilled by the skill of the wordsmith, into a place where interaction has been expected and invited. This question marks the moment the poem turns from addressing an unseen or unspecified listener or reader to a specified one. Are you surprised? Are you judging me yet? It moves the poem from a general and unspecified time to a specific moment of the here and now. The poem, and by extension the speaker of the poem, and by extension the poet, sees the audience and their response, catching them out in a moment of possible judgment. If the poem is a confession, then maybe the audience are asked to confess something as well. In the poem, judgment is a foregone conclusion by the use of the tiny 3-letter word yet at the end of the line. Are you surprised? Are you judging me yet? The implication is that if you aren't being judgmental now, you will be eventually. The you that is carrying out the judgment could be male or female, but the use of the word yet betrays the speaker, who is also judging herself. In Age, Race, Class and Sex, Audre Lorde draws on philosopher Paulo Freire to insist that the focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us and which knows only the oppressor's tactics, the oppressor's relationships. The oppressor inside the self is betrayed in this poem, in the body of the question and the white space that surrounds the text. The yes shouted out by the woman whose face I would not recognize on the street, but whose voice and accent I would know anywhere, could also be called a heckle. It could be called a joke. It could also be called sexism. It could be called harm or harmful. It could be called nothing. It was nothing. It could be called judgmental. At the time, I burst out laughing. It was funny. Part of me is still laughing, slightly hysterically. In Excitable Speech, Judith Butler argues that when a speaker utters a racist slur, it is harmful because of the history of that slur, because they are making a linguistic community with a history of speakers. She writes that in the speaking of a racial slur, one chimes in with a chorus of racists, and it is only because we know its force from its prior instances do we know it to be so offensive now. This idea that the utterance of an insult connects the speaker and the address to an historical community of racists is a powerful one and can be translated across to other types of insults such as sexism, ableism, and homophobia. In subsequent performances of this poem, I leave a beat of silence, of emptiness, in case another yes is called out from the audience, or even a no. That moment of judgment, that affirmative yes, is painful not because the addressee has judged, but because they have joined an historical community of people who have judged women for having sexual desire. Fast forward to another event, another time. I'm giving a seminar at a university. I read the poem and tell the story of the yes. A woman asks me what happens if someone shouts no. At first, I do not know the answer, and then I do. Because if someone shouted no, my own expectation of being judged reveals itself for what it is, which is my own sexism, which is that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep, which I carry with me, which I am writing out of me, which I am both uncovering and covering with language, over and over again. In Talking Back, Bell Hooks discusses her own desire for approval. She says, when I first began to talk publicly about my work, I would be disappointed when audiences were provoked and challenged but seemed to disapprove. Not only was my desire for approval naive, I have since come to understand that it is silly to think that one can challenge and also have approval. It was dangerous, precisely because such a longing can undermine radical commitment, compelling a change in voice so as to gain regard. This desire for approval and fear when met with disapproval has been something that I've wrestled with throughout my poetic practice, and in particular in the performing and publication of these poems. This was an important piece of writing for me to read in my journey as a writer and a feminist. To be able to sit with discomfort, both my discomfort and the discomfort of an audience or reader, was difficult to learn and to carry out. To understand that discomfort can lead to possible change for both myself and the audience. To realise that discomfort can lead to what Bell Hooks calls critical consciousness, which is not just naming and raising awareness of sexism, but critical understanding of the concrete material that lays the groundwork for that personal experience and what must be done to transform it. I've created my own strategies for coping with disapproval or defensiveness, and perhaps the hardest of these to learn has been the strategy of continuing to speak out, of not placating, of not retreating to the familiar territory of silence or humour. R.A. Ferguson argues that Audre Lorde used poetry as a way of instigating an intimate scrutiny needed for personal and social transformation, and that in fact poetry was the linchpin between the personal and the social. These connections between the personal and the social are still at the heart of both feminism and poetry. The permeable border between the two seems like the perfect place for both the poet and poetry to inhabit, in the same way that the border between creative critical practice has enabled me to combine the naming of experience with critical understanding of the concrete material that lays the groundwork for the personal experience. This striving towards understanding is another strategy I've deployed to cope with disapproval, defensiveness, or aggression. Bell Hooks argued that the feminist consciousness raising sessions that happened in the 60s and 70s were only the first stage in the process of radical transformation, and then that the next stage would have been the confrontation between women and men, the sharing of this new and radical speech, women speaking to men in a liberated voice. Poetry can move past the naming of experience to speak in a liberated voice, not just naming and giving voice to that experience, but building what Bell Hooks calls critical consciousness that teaches about structures of domination and how they function. Each time I perform that poem in public, each time I summon men into being with language, naming without naming, wielding the gaze and not looking away, each time I watch them all disappear, each time I honour the white space of the poem with silence, each time I wait for a yes or a no, I am resisting the potential oppressor within, as Hooks calls it. I am also giving her a voice. I am also bringing her into the light.
Okay, so the next poll here has just got two options in it, hopefully coming up now. So the first one is to hear poems of desire, a mode of attention, and the second, sexism is a slippery and fluid term. Okay, we've got a very clear runaway choice here. As you'll see, that's for sexism as a slippery and fluid term.
Okay. I don't think I've read this one either. Sexism is a slippery and fluid term. Rosalind Gill pointed out that the term sexism has quite literally disappeared from much feminist academic writing. That was in 2011. Calderdor argues that according to post-feminist discourse, the issue of sexism and gender inequality has disappeared, particularly in Western societies where sexism has been transplanted onto other cultures. The problem of sexism is hidden in plain sight, routinely presented as harmless, and is a white noise. In 2014, Laura Bates set up the Everyday Sexism website. Women could upload their experiences from the niggling and normalised to the outrageously offensive. In April 2015, 20 months after the project was launched, 100,000 entries had been uploaded to the website. In the book Everyday Sexism, which followed the project, Bates writes that while she initially set out to record daily instances of sexism, it quickly came to document cases of serious harassment and assault, abuse and rape. Adrienne Rich writes, when a woman tells the truth, she creates the possibility for more truth around her. And this can be seen in action, both on the Everyday Sexism website and today across various social media sites. In 2017, the celebrity Alyssa Milano spoke out on Twitter about her own experience of sexual assault, encouraging followers to reply with "Me Too" if they'd experienced something similar. The hashtag #MeToo went viral as women joined in to speak out about their experiences of gender-based violence. Though this was the movement, the Me Too movement arrived into a wider public consciousness, it was actually conceived by the Black activist Tarana Burke over 10 years ago as a grassroots movement aimed at helping Black women who were survivors of sexual assault and violence. Despite the outpouring of Me Too stories since then, which have produced a shift in thinking around speaking out about gender-based violence, the word sexism still has, as Gill says, a quaint, old-fashioned ring to it, in a way that it was strikingly not paralleled by notions of racism or homophobia. It is apparent that sexism is a slippery and fluid term which resists definition and boundaries to encompass harassment, oppression, abuse, and assault. Gill's call for a reconceptualization of sexism as agile, dynamic, changing, and diverse set of malleable representations and practices of power is both needed and relevant to my research. Even the term everyday sexism, with its connotations of being casual or ordinary, comes under pressure when the everyday is more serious and more violent than has been previously understood. In the same way that the everyday sexism website was inundated with serious accounts of sexual harassment and assault alongside more minor incidents, I realised through my own poetic practice that I categorise different types of gender-based harassment and aggression as sexism, when a more accurate descriptive term would be assault. The word sexism becomes a coping mechanism, a way of diminishing or minimising what has happened. The act of putting the white space of a poem around a recounting of an experience of sexism enabled me to look at the experience differently. Gregory Orr argues that the act of writing a lyric poem means that we have shifted the crisis to a bearable distance from us, removed it to the symbolic but vivid world of language. Second, we have actively made and shaped this model of our situation, rather than passively endured it as lived experience. Shaping a model of my situation, as Orr puts it, allowed me to see differently regarding experiences of sexism. It enabled me to understand my own complicity and to understand that writing about sexism is messy work, because to do this, a writer has to, as Sarah Ahmed says, think strategically. We also have to accept our complicity. We forego any illusions of parity. We give up the safety of exteriority. Part of this process involved coming to the realization that for some women, feminine existence is in fact a traumatized existence. That's a quote from Wolf and Stacey. This traumatized existence is multifaceted and complex, and a part of understanding is acknowledging that women experience sexism in a multitude of ways. It can be concealed under what Sarah Ahmed says, under the language of civility, happiness, and love, which can leave women questioning whether they have imagined it or whether they are being paranoid or oversensitive. Understanding that some women's experience is traumatized may require a reframing and expansion of our understanding of trauma and resultant post-traumatic stress disorder to encompass the everyday assaults on integrity and personal safety that many women suffer. The traditional definition of PTSD required the individual to have been confronted with death, threatened death, or actual or threatened injury to or violence, including sexual violence. This definition, drawn from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, has only recently been expanded to include sexual violence at all. The historical recognition of PTSD has been limited, as Brown says, to public and male experiences of trauma, and has failed to acknowledge the daily lived experiences of women and other minority groups. Maria Root coined the term insidious trauma to describe the effects of oppression that are not necessarily overtly violent or threatening to bodily well-being at the given moment, but that do violence to the soul and spirit. And that was Brown writing in 1995. The poems contained within this thesis attempt to capture what it is to be traumatized by existence, to be, as Kathy Carruth says, possessed by an image or event, to live with repetition and circularity, because if sexism has anything at its center, it is its propensity to repeat, repeat, repeat. What happens when the reader is asked to look and to look again, and to choose again to look at the things that most people look away from or ignore? Even when sexism is happening to me, I have chosen to look away, to pretend nothing is happening, and even this action is a reliance upon the defences of denial and minimisation. Putting these experiences into the framework of a lyric poem ensures that I cannot rely on these defences anymore. As discussed at greater length in the section Lyric Variations, the lyric convention of significance comes into operation when these experiences are placed in the framework of a lyric poem. It is hard to minimise an event when the space of a poem is placed around it. It is hard to minimise a moment in time as only a moment when it is placed into the lyric present. Sarah Ahmed wrote, "If a world can be what we learn not to notice, noticing becomes a form of political labour." I am writing poems that notice things. I am writing poems that recount the noticing of sexism, and in doing so, I become, as Ahmed writes, a retrospective witness of my own becoming. Vicki Bertram says, I want to ask, how do I create what Bertram calls a female lyric voice whose authority is accepted as transcending its femaleness to speak of general insights or truths? How do I do this when the truth I am writing about is sexism, and sexism is often denied? Is it possible to transcend femaleness when writing about sexism? Is transcending femaleness something I want to aspire to anyway? What I do know is that writing about poetry about sexism and reading poems about sexism to an audience and being supported by the framework of a lyric poem feels safer and easier than a conversation across a table or amongst friends about sexism and its impact on my daily lived experience. One common reaction which fits into Ahmed's category of sexism or violence underneath the language of civility, happiness and love is to finish a reading and then be complimented straight away on my appearance by a man. I finish reading my poetry, which might be about an experience of sexism or serious assault or female desire or both. Which will probably be poems about relationality and how we relate to each other and fail each other. And in that vulnerable moment after the reading, a man will come up to me and tell me how much he likes my hair or my shoes. And these are compliments, and I should be flattered, but I am not, because my suspicion is that they are dismissals, whether conscious or unconscious, of my poetry and myself. Back to Vicki Bertram, when she said that women poets have to confront the implications of being a woman on display. Often the implications and the cost of being a woman on display is that you are dismissed as a poet and instead your body is addressed, and it is as if your work did not exist. You are put into your place as a body. I am giving a creative critical reading of some of my PhD work. I've read the first paragraph, which introduces my topic, everyday sexism, and a man puts his hand up, though he does not wait to be invited to speak. He tells me that sexism does not exist. The irony of giving a talk about sexism and being interrupted by a man to be told sexism does not exist is not lost on me. It is exhausting to keep on insisting that something exists in a world which will not admit that it does exist. I tell myself that merely by talking about it, as Sarah Ahmed says, merely by talking about sexism or racism here and now, I'm refusing displacement. I keep taking up space. And yet, at the same event, which is a mixture of a lecture and a poetry reading, another man tries to offer support when the first man continues to talk. He tells the audience and me about a time when he had his bottom pinched in 1985 when walking through a factory of female workers, concluding that sexism does exist and it works both ways. I feel exhausted already, even though I haven't really begun my lecture yet. I think about the way analogies work. In a discussion of how white people often use analogies to refocus attention on themselves and appropriate pain in discussions about race, Grillo and Wildman write that the analogy makes the analogizer forget the difference and allows her to stay focused on her own situation without grappling with the other person's reality. At the reading, the man who used the analogy about his own experience of sexism was well-meaning, but his anecdote succeeded in what Grillo and Wildman call taking back the centre ground or stealing the centre. They also point out that members of dominant groups assume that in discourse they should be the speaker rather than the listener. It has become apparent in the performing of poems which explore experiences of sexism that many men do not know how to respond except through defensiveness, compliments about my appearance, or false analogies to refocus attention and time onto men rather than onto women. I understand the impulse to analogize because I do this when I'm trying to understand racism or homophobia or the experience of disabled students moving through a world that is not designed to let them move safely. I have to stop myself doing it as well. Performing these poems, reading from creative critical work, is not a consciousness-raising session, and yet I have seen that these poems raise consciousness in both women and men. I return again to bell hooks and her call for new and radical speech. Can speech which contains information about sexism, whilst also uncovering sexism in the room, be new and radical, or are the same patterns being reenacted over and over again? Or maybe I am asking the wrong questions. Do I trust poetry to be transformative or not? The act of performing poetry and the space of silence around a poem as it is read, or the publishing of a poem in the white space of silence on the printed page, is this enough? Am I speaking in a new and liberated voice? Maybe it is impossible to know what the right questions are when thinking about sexism. Every question risks missing another part of the puzzle. I can ask questions like, can poems about sexism raise consciousness about sexism? And can poems about sexism raise the consciousness we already have about sexism to the surface? And what does our consciousness around sexism look like? I could ask what transformation looks like. What does a new and liberated voice sound like? Who am I talking to anyway? Who am I looking at? Sexism is dynamic and embedded, fluid and static. It is all of these things, and so asking questions, the wrong ones and the right ones, becomes an ethical, aesthetical practice to keep trying to articulate the shape of what the questions miss.
Okay. Yeah, just go on with one more, Kim.
Yeah, and if it's a, I'll leave. If it's a poem one that comes up, I'll cut it short.
Okay. All right. So this will be our last poll, I think, and we've got three choices again. So if you've ever experienced sexism before, vote for Not Looking Away, a Poetics of Attention. If you've been a perpetrator of sexism, vote for Not Looking Away, a Poetics of Attention. And if you'd like to think about relationality instead, vote for Something in the Telling, a Poetics of Relationality.
These polls are anonymous, by the way. We can't tell what you voted for. Because, yeah, if I was voting, I've been a perpetrator of sexism. I've said like sexist things to women and to men. So I would have to vote for that one. Now you tell us, someone says, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
We know nothing. Okay, pretty much all the votes are in. It's pretty close. Okay, but we do have a winner, as you can see. So our last section will be Not Looking Away, the Poetics of Attention, with 51% of the vote.
I'm just going to read one more poem, so we've finished with the poem, and then there'll be time for if anyone wants any questions, has any questions, sorry. Oh, the taxi driver poem. I'll read that one because I read I knew he would appear. I can never get rid of him. Okay. Not Looking Away, a Poetics of Attention. Although we've only just met, he's already telling me that no, my suitcase isn't heavy at all, as he lifts it with one hand into the boot. He's not even reached the end of the road, and he's already telling me I have a crazy soul, that he can tell how crazy I am. He asks me, do I know what he means? And I smile and pretend that I don't. He says all the women he knows who are artists or poets or musicians are crazy. Crazy, 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 he says, and I wish I'd told him I was an accountant instead. But on he goes, taking his eyes off the road, to tell me all women who are artists are crazy in bed. Do I know what he means? They want to try crazy things in the bedroom. If he stops the car, I could open the door and run, or pull out my phone and pretend someone is calling, or ask him politely what's wrong. I could laugh at the next thing he says, while the voice in my head whispers that somehow I've led him on, that I was asking for it. I remember a train journey, everyone crammed in, and a stranger's penis pressed against my leg, convincing myself I was imagining it, or he couldn't help it. Where else in the place could he put it? When we pull up at the airport, my arm flings open the door before I give it permission. My left leg finds the pavement before I can think. Still, I turn back to give him a tip, and he's laughing, saying, "Relax, just relax." And I know that he knows I'm afraid, that I've been afraid all my life, but it's not this that makes me ashamed.
Okay, thanks, Kim.
Thank you. Thanks for listening,
You've got
everyone.
this silent applause coming through. We have got a few minutes for questions if anyone wants to raise any, either speak up or use the chat. There was one question, Kim, that I wanted to raise that came in a little while ago in relation to the poem "Yes, I'm Judging You." This is from McIntyre. So she's asking, is judgment always negative? What if you were judged to be excellent or honest?
Yeah, I guess judgment can, I'm using it in a kind of loaded way here because of the experience of performing that poem, but I guess judgment can be positive and negative, and we're all kind of judging all the time. So we judge everything that other people are doing all the time. So I did have a question in the original thesis which said, are you feeling judgmental? But when I tried it out in the events, nobody ever admitted to being judgmental. So I changed the question. But yeah, I think judgment can be positive, I guess.
Are there any other questions? I've got one question, if I can ask you. And I was just thinking about the structure of this and sort of, the myriad ways that you can move through the material. Like, as you said, tonight, actually, we've read sections that you've not read before in doing similar events. But you also mentioned that you've changed the order of some of the poems subsequently. So I was just wondering if was kind of guiding the process about thinking about the ordering of the poems, because obviously that alters to a certain extent the ways in which the work's going to be read and come across, and the choices that then follow from it.
Yeah, well, when the book comes out, it will just I think it's just going to be it will just be the poems. So the All the Men I Never Married, number 40, I originally had that at I was thinking that's going to be the end of the collection, and that's how it went into the thesis. But for me, it always felt like the start of the PhD. That was one of the first poems that I wrote, and I felt like it was to have it at the end was just summing everything up too kind of neatly. I wanted it at the beginning because a lot of the men that get mentioned throughout the poem then get a whole poem to themselves. So it's almost like kind of having a little map at the beginning. So they kind of disappear at the end of the poem, but then they might reappear throughout the collection. And then the ordering, I'm still kind of messing about with it and probably driving, because Amy Wack, my editor, is here now, and I've already sent one version to her, and I'm going to annoy her by it because I've emailed her and said I'm just playing around with the order still. And so what I've been doing since then is writing down what I think links each poem from one to the other. So sometimes I put two poems next to each other which show different ways of being silenced, or different ways that the body is controlled. So so yeah, I'm trying to find kind of little links like that basically, but the collection won't have those signposts, you know, poems of willfulness. I don't think I'll dare do that in a poetry collection, because it's like anathema. You know, if poets say, oh, I'm going to read a poem, the worst one is if you say I'm going to read a funny poem and then nobody laughs in the reading. So if you you know, if you tell an audience what the poem's going to be about, it always kind of crashes and burns. So I probably won't have the signposts, the titles, but yeah. And so also thinking about the order, I sent it to the poet Jacqueline Safra. She read the whole collection for me as well, and I said, just give me your thoughts on the order. And she pointed out that I had a lot of the darker poems, which I didn't read any of them really tonight, the really dark stuff. A lot of them were appearing at the end of the manuscript, and she said she thought that they should come in much more sporadically, to kind of, because what I'm writing about is, or what I want to write about, is how sexism exists alongside desire, how women have to discover female desire in this landscape of violence, and how the two can exist at the same time, sometimes in the same relationship. So she suggested putting the kind of darker poems, some of them earlier on, spread them throughout, so they can be next to a light poem and then straight into a darker one, which I was kind of avoiding before. So she said she felt like if the manuscript is going up to a crescendo, it feels a bit too contrived, whereas if they're more kind of scattergun, it feels more like normal life. So as soon as she said that, that kind of made a lot of sense. So that's kind of driven a lot of the change of the order now.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Kim, so much for this. I don't imagine you've had an opportunity to see the comments coming through at the end of this, but you should have a look. Lots of wonderful comments about it being a great evening, poems and the analysis working fantastically together. I second all of those. So thank you so much, it's fantastic. And thanks to everyone for coming and your contributions. I still love this as a kind of innovative way of using Zoom and thinking about what readings can be, and Kim, your work just seems to work brilliantly in this format, so thanks for doing it.
Thank you. And I forgot to say thanks to Nikolai for hosting and doing the polls. I did do this event as just to a small group of young writers, and I thought I'll just do the polls myself. There's only 10 people watching, and I was completely lost without Nikolai to do the polls. It was really hard. So it's a harder job then. And thanks for the supervision as well. And thank you to Paul Wake and the Manchester Games Studies Network for hosting the event. And this would be the third and final one for a long time. So thank you all for coming to listen as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to clap too.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
I'll stop the recording.